Well, I mean, it was kind of weird. Literally, there was a coffin on the stage. Music started, and I think the curtains were pulled back. It was weird music. Lights would go down, and then the coffin lid would open. A tall, skinny guy who was in the coffin with a cloak on, stood up out of the coffin, held the cloak on either side of him, and that was the start of the coffin disco.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Little Bangor Stories. This time we're exploring memories of one of the most unusual youth facilities ever in Bangor, the famous Coffin Disco, with two friends who were there around 55 years ago, Campbell Foster and Archie Walls. Here's Archie to explain exactly where it was.
The Coffin Disco was held in the Bangor Roman Catholic Parish Hall, known to the locals as the Little Flower Hall. It was an initiative, if you like, of the Catholic Church at the time. I've never thought of that before, really, as to how it came about, but clearly it was, because it wouldn't have been in that hall otherwise. But it was absolutely supported by everyone in the town. It was absolutely not a Catholic event in the town.
What do you mean by that? Do you mean it wasn't just Catholic kids that went along to it?
Absolutely. It was. There were from all arts and parts of Bangor and further.
It was part of the school when we were at the actual primary school. So there were events that were held in it. Christmas time, Santa used to come, and it seemed big in the day. Probably if you looked back on it now, it would be tiny. When you were going into the Little Flower Hall from Brunswick Road, you had to walk the full length of the playground, what would have been the old playground. And when you were going in on a Friday night, I can't remember whether it was just a Friday night or whether it was Friday and Saturday, I can't remember. You know, you could walk along the whole length of that playground, and there were people queuing to get in. So it was, and people milling around that wee playground area.
I can't be absolutely accurate on when it started and when it ended. I know that in 1971, that's when I was going to it.
Yeah, that fits in for...
But I don't think it was happening long before 1971, and I can't imagine that it happened long after 1971 either.
No, I was trying to think of that the other day, and it just seemed to be, I think like most of those things in your past, it really only did happen for a very short period of time, but it seemed like a lifetime.
Yeah.
Like summer holidays always seemed long, really, really long, but it wasn't really that long a time.
And it was a big event in the life of a 15-year-old boy.
Yeah.
It was a big, serious weekend, exciting event.
Would there have been many people in there? Was it packed?
There was generally a very good crowd. I can imagine that I was like nearly the first to arrive because I thought it was such an exciting thing, and probably watched the crowd build up. But
and as boys, I mean, did you go in and sit in one side of the hall, or did you just hang around with your hands in your pockets?
Yeah,
waiting for something to happen?
We were hard men.
Yeah.
No, you weren't.
No, we weren't.
There was a lot of boys hanging around together, and as I recall,
Scared of the girls. We're hanging around together.
I don't remember it as what, how some people describe the dance hall things, like a cattle market. I don't remember like the women being on one side and the men being on the other. It didn't seem to be like that. It was more hanging around in bunches and talking amongst yourselves and saying things like, I fancy her, and stuff like that.
Yeah. Sending people from one side of the hall to the other to speak to.
Yeah.
somebody for you on your behalf, or that walk, the terrifying walk towards a bank of girls sitting on chairs.
I can remember boys having representatives. my friend wants to know if you'll go with him. Now, what go meant, I have no idea.
Fancy a lumber?
So you've got in, you've met up with your friends, you're in one group of boys, so all the girls are in their groups of girls, and the excitement is building. So then what happens next? Do the lights go down? Tell me all about it.
Well, I mean, it was kind of weird. Literally, there was a coffin on the stage behind curtains at one stage, and the curtains open. And
Now we're at the little flower hall here.
Yes,
Let's
yes.
just get that straight.
Yes.
So there was a coffin behind curtains on the stage
And the
of a
music-
Catholic parochial hall.
yes,
Yes, indeed.
the music started, and
Yeah.
I think the curtains been pulled back, and there was weird music. Well, I'm not sure whether there wasn't smoke machines. Well, there was a lot of smoke because people were allowed to smoke. Well, not allowed to smoke. People were smoking in
People
the
were
hall.
taking the opportunity to
Yes,
smoke.
and so the music started, and the lights would go down, and then the coffin lid would open, and
I can't actually remember this, but I can imagine that there was some sort of eerie music being played.
Yeah,
And
vampirish.
the DJ would arise out of the coffin and go and take his place behind the desk, as it.
I seem to remember that the guy who was getting out of the coffin was the son of one of our teachers, Mrs. Bateson. Mm-hmm. Now, I can see the big guy who looked like he actually could have been a vampire, and his big tall skinny guy who was in the coffin with a cloak on and stood up out of the coffin, held the cloak either side of him, and that was the start of the coffin disco. But I've since had queries from other people who seem to think that it wasn't Raymond Bateson.
Okay.
I think they said somebody McSparron or.
I've only ever thought it was Bateson because you had thought it was Bateson.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
I had no idea who it was. I can remember at the time thinking that, he was a grown-up, but
Yep.
he was probably only about 18 or 19.
Well, yeah, and if it is the Mr. Bateson that I think it was, he went on to be a teacher, and I think he may have been a teacher in either St. Columbanus or even St. Comgall's.
So anyway, our vampire gets up out of the
Not all the
coffin.
time. Didn't all the time. He didn't always get up.
I thought it was. It was not a weekly feature.
It was until the cigarette butt incidents when people got a bit fed up with just him getting out of the coffin and stepping out. So as the coffin lid would open, the cigarette butts started to get flicked in, and his cloak caught away.
You're quite right.
Yeah.
And I had forgotten that
Yeah,
completely.
yeah.
You said he had a desk. Was that on the side of the stage? Was that?
Yeah, I can remember him like being accessible because you'd be up asking him to play. Can you play this? Can you play that? So
And he's playing vinyl, of course.
he'd play vinyl, which is all there was at the time. I mean, you were playing the hits of the day, and it was on vinyl.
So did you ever go up and ask him for a record?
I can remember one occasion asking him to play "In My Chair" by Status Quo because he had been playing it a couple of weeks beforehand, and then he'd stopped playing it, and I really liked it, and I wanted to hear it again. It was one of their early hits. It was very bluesy, and it was absolutely nothing like what Status Quo became about 20 years later, like rocking all over the world and nonsense like that. In My Chair is a very credible attempt at the blues.
But Campbell, you
Sorry, I love that. And nonsense like that.
But do you have different memories of the music that was played?
I haven't got a very good music memory of, I couldn't tell you this song was played in this year and this was released in this year and this person sang this. But I do know that whenever I hear a certain song, I go, yes,
Coffin Disco.
I could, that was in the Coffin Disco.
Yeah.
Ask me now what that was, I couldn't tell you. But I do know there was very much sort of in the 71 sort of, that sort of time, you definitely would have had the Michael Jackson type things, you know, the young Jackson.
Yeah,
sound.
there was a Jackson 5 and all,
yes.
and you know, he had to play lots of different stuff for all of the different.
Yeah.
You know, the girls wanted different music to the boys, and you know, it was.
It was sort of pop music. It
Yeah.
wasn't heavy music. There wasn't an awful lot of,
there were some heavy tracks at it.
but there would have been no.
But they were singles, like
Yeah.
they weren't.
But
like,
he wouldn't have been playing the B side of a
No.
single,
And,
you know.
there was yes, you're right. It was always hits.
Yes, it was,
and there was no obscure stuff.
No.
In terms of like heaviness, if you like, what comes to mind from that? Well, from the Coffin Disco is Black Knight by Deep Purple.
Yep.
Paranoid
Yep.
by Black Sabbath.
Yep.
I also remember Neil Diamond, Lynn Anderson, Rose Garden.
Yeah.
I remember that being played. That was a girl's favourite.
Well, hold on. You say a girl's favourite, but it meant that there was a chance of a snog. So,
Well, of course.
So
of course.
it might have been the girl's favourite, but you
Well,
certainly knew.
You have to take these things in order. First of all, there's a chance of a dance, and then a chance of a snog. But snogs didn't come, of course, until the slow dances came on.
Well, now speaking of slow dances, let's bear in mind that this was a youth event in a Catholic parochial hall. Was there ever a priest around?
I can't really remember seeing a priest about the place, but my uncle used to parade around the place at times in a vigilante sort of way.
Now I can remember Father Murray. Walking around.
Yeah, and I'm not going to dispute that. The reason I remember my uncle is I used to be terribly embarrassed that my uncle was walking around. Of course, his daughter was there, so of course he's going to be there, you know, keeping an eye on what's going on.
But do you think he had maybe volunteered to some committee or other to keep an eye on the youngsters?
No,
or was he just following his daughter in the doors?
I think he was just making it his business to know what was going on in there because his daughter was in there.
And were there many other daddies of
No,
little girls?
there may well have been. I just knew that this guy was my uncle, and I was, and with apologies to Margaret, it used to be terribly embarrassing that your dad was walking around the place.
I'm sure she was pretty embarrassed too.
Probably.
You had a few dances and a few slow dances and maybe a few kisses if you were lucky or whatever. What time did
No
it finish?
kissing.
What time did it
No,
finish at?
no, it was lumbering.
Lumber.
For those who don't know what a lumber is, it sort of equates to snog.
Move your lips very, very in a rotational manner around the face of a girl.
it was very good for your neck muscles.
Sometimes you might even hit her lips.
Yeah, and it was also important that if you were moving anti-clockwise, she had to move anti-clockwise as well. Otherwise, you could fall.
A hall packed with excited teenagers, full of soft drinks, crisps and hormones. I asked Campbell and Archie if it always ran smoothly. And did that time in our history, the early years of the Troubles, affect the mood?
There were also, you know, as we would discover as we got a bit older, you know, a dance or a disco is a place where you can have a fight as well if you want. There were fights at it. I can remember, I don't want to mention names.
Was this for the love of a lady?
Yeah, for the love of a lady. But I can remember a fight breaking out, and I can remember the lady being heavily involved in the fight as well.
Some people did come in with drink on them. There were fights, as you say, because I remember people stumbling in. There could be times when it was a bit It was a bit hairy, actually. It was a bit.
Yeah.
And do you think that might have contributed to, it
It's
got
1971 after all.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. Although, things hadn't got too bad in 71. But yeah, you're right. It was starting. It was kicking off.
Yeah.
At that time, I was still at school, which was St Patrick's College, which is now Our Lady in St Patrick's. And I can remember bringing friends down from Belfast to attend. So, people did travel, not in droves, but in ones and twos. They travelled from far-flung places like Belfast to come down to it.
So you're not too sure exactly how long the coffin disco reigned over Bangor, but when it closed, were you at the last dance, or had you forgotten all about it by then, or?
I think I think I had moved on. I mean,
My circumstances were that I sort of left Bangor to go and live in Donaghadee, and don't know, how it fizzled out, but clearly it did.
and then I was at work. I had started work, which that's saying I had grown up, but you weren't going to a disco that
Yeah.
14.
Yeah, your horizons changed.
yes.
Yeah.
It's alongside the coffin disco, but near the end of the coffin disco, there were quite a few other discos around that sprung up.
And who ran these ones?
Well, I mean, there was First Bangor had a disco in a youth. They had a youth club.
Yeah,
A
a
youth
hall beside the church.
A hall beside the church.
Yeah.
Epworth Hall was maybe around about that time, but it was more a youth club than a disco.
Yeah, sometimes they had a disco.
Yes, but it wasn't
a regular
a
thing.
regular thing.
It was a coffee place.
Yeah. Cloud Nine was probably, well, there was Cloud Nine, and there was it Hamilton House? There was one along on the Hamilton Road.
The Rave Cave. I think that might have been the council,
Yeah.
because that was a council. The Borough Gymnasium was the precursor to the modern day leisure centre. Yeah.
Was that the blue buildings that was part of the tech? No.
It was on the Bangor side of those blue buildings. It's where there's a new community centre.
Yeah. I mean, Cloud Nine and the Rave Cave were distinctly and older. There were bikers, the Bangor bikers and the Ards bikers, and the sort of, I don't know whether you really call them heavy metal people back in the day, but the people who were into heavier music were in the likes of Cloud Nine. The Rave Cave was more drugs, funnily enough. The Rave Cave was more dark.
Yeah.
Dark. Cloud Nine was dark as well, but Rave Cave was actually, I found it quite, I said scary, but quite, you couldn't see what was going on. Cloud Nine was in the Co-op Hall.
Cloud Nine was in the Co-op Hall. I have no idea who the organisers were. The Cloud Nine, not that I've been there, but our friend Michael used to go to it.
I was there a few times.
And it seemed to be more a live band thing than a disco.
Tell you the truth, if there was a live band there, I couldn't see them because it was literally so dark. You went in and the lights went out and there was black light.
Were they for adults, people over 18, or were they still aiming for a youth market, albeit slightly older teenagers?
It was youth, but it wasn't 14, 15-year-olds.
No, it wasn't. But it wasn't. It also wasn't 25-year-olds.
No.
Do you know what I mean?
It was definitely 18, 19-year-olds.
Yeah, 18, 19. But I mean, 18, 19-year-old was a bigger person when you were 15.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like they were older people.
you were
wow.
old.
Yeah, you were old when you were 19.
I take it there was no alcohol served at these.
No alcohol served. Not to say there was no alcohol taken.
The friends have talked about how a piece of music on the radio can take them right back to those nights. But what about their best memories?
Best memory? I could more easily talk of some disappointing memories.
Oh, go on.
No, because it would involve the names of young ladies and stuff. Look, I can only remember the coffin disco fondly, without actually thinking of any particular moment, which I suppose standing round in the middle, stomping my feet with about 10 or 12 other guys singing Power to the People was, in my fledgling years as a politically motivated person, that seemed to be an important thing to do. And the harder you stamped your feet, the better it was for society.
Best moment, my goodness. My first girlfriend probably was the first, when I say girlfriend, first girl that, you arranged to meet was, you'd meet in the Coffin Disco. I'm not going to tell you her name. But that would have been the very first time you would have gone out, met a girl who wasn't from the town, by the way, and you went into a place together. That was like, you were big boy then.
An adult.
You were an adult then, I think worst times were probably whenever it was finishing and you weren't quite able to get into those bigger places. It was your own, not puberty, but your own growing up, your own changing. To leave school and go to work when you were 15, for me, was a big separator from, people like you, Archie, who were still at school. So I would have to wait 2 years or 3 years before, yous were, So that was...
So we had money?
To use it money, I didn't have to sub you. No, I didn't. But, so by the time it was closing, by the time it was finishing off, I was an adult.
A big thanks to Archie Walls and Campbell Foster for sharing their Coffin Disco story. But maybe you have memories of brilliant times at teenage dances and youth clubs in Bangor over the 80s, 90s and beyond. I'd love to share them. Get in touch on the website littlebangorstories.co.uk. We're also on Facebook, X, Insta and Blue Sky, so please follow, like and share. Thank you for listening. Until the next time.